If you'd told me at 7 years old, holding a plastic ring pop and solemnly promising to marry Ethan Whitfield when we grew up, that 20 years later I'd throw a private party in my head when he dumped me in front of 200 people, I would not have believed you. But there I was, at the Whitfield family's annual autumn gala at the Boston Harbor Hotel, 3 glasses of champagne deep, watching my childhood fiancé clear his throat at the microphone like he was about to announce a merger instead of end my life, as everyone in this room understood it. Daniel, Ethan said, and the way he said my name, gently, like he was defusing a bomb, should have hurt more than it did. You know I care about you. You're my best friend. But I can't keep pretending this is what either of us wants. 200 pairs of eyes swiveled to me. My Aunt Carol's champagne flute froze halfway to her mouth. Somewhere near the ice sculpture, Ethan's mother pressed a hand to her pearls like she'd personally choreographed this humiliation and was disappointed in the blocking. I stood up. Here is the internal monologue that ran through my head in the 4 seconds before I opened my mouth. Oh, thank God. Oh, thank you, God, Buddha, whichever deity handles arranged marriage loopholes. I am free. I am a bird. I am. I agree, I said out loud. The room made a sound like a held breath being let go wrong, somewhere between a gasp and a wheeze. Ethan blinked at me, microphone still in hand, visibly thrown by the fact that I hadn't cried, hadn't begged, hadn't done a single dramatic thing befitting 20 years of engagement. You agree, he repeated. Wholeheartedly, I said, and I smiled, and it was not a brave, brittle, secretly devastated smile. It was the smile of a man who just found out his student loans were forgiven. Honestly, Ethan, I think this is very mature of you, very growth-oriented. Have you told Vivian yet, or was this the surprise? Vivian Marsh, alpha, heiress to a shipping fortune, and the reason Ethan had spent the last 6 months at the office until 11 p.m. went the color of the tablecloth. Ethan's mouth opened and closed twice, like a very handsome, very wealthy fish. I turned to the room, raised my glass, and said, "To Ethan and Vivian, may your merger be prosperous." And then I sat down and ate the rest of my chicken because it was genuinely very good chicken, and I refused to let heartbreak I didn't feel ruin a $400 a plate dinner. My Aunt Carol leaned over. "Daniel Hayes, what is wrong with you?" "Nothing," I whispered back, delighted. "For the first time in my life, absolutely nothing." Quick pause before we keep going. If you're the kind of reader who needs to know how a man goes from publicly dumped at a gala to acquires $10 billion and marries a stranger who fights bar stools, you're exactly who this story's for. Follow along so you don't miss where this goes. It gets significantly more unhinged from here. Let me back up, because I realize arranged childhood engagement sounds like something out of a period drama, and you're picturing corsets. It wasn't like that. It was Boston old money doing what Boston old money does. My late father had been business partners with Ethan's father decades ago, and somewhere between golf games and God knows what handshake deal, our fathers decided their sons would marry. I was 3. Ethan was 4. Neither of us was consulted, which frankly tracks. My parents died when I was 9. Car accident, rain, a bridge on Route 2 I still won't drive over. And Aunt Carol raised me on a nurse's salary in a 2-bedroom walk-up in Somerville while the Whitfields kept checking in, which mostly meant reminding me, gently and often, of my obligations. I grew up knowing 2 things about my future. I would become a nurse like my aunt because it was steady and it mattered, and I would marry Ethan Whitfield because it had been decided before I could talk. I loved Ethan the way you love a brother you've been assigned. We built pillow forts. He taught me to drive stick in a Whitfield family parking garage, and we dented a pillar and blamed a raccoon. But somewhere around 23, watching him light up around a shipping heiress the way he never once lit up around me, I understood that whatever we had, it wasn't the thing everyone kept insisting it was. I spent the better part of a year telling myself the flatness I felt wasn't a warning sign, just what long-term love was supposed to feel like once the newness wore off. Steady, familiar, a little dull. It took Ethan actually falling for someone else to show me the difference between contentment and settling, and I'm still, honestly, a little embarrassed it took me that long to notice. So no, my heart was not broken in that ballroom. My heart, if anything, did a small cartwheel. By midnight I was in my scrubs at Massachusetts General, because apparently my body understood that champagne and adrenaline made an excellent combination for a double shift in the ER, and also because I'd rather stitch up a stranger's forehead than sit in my apartment replaying The Way Mrs. Whitfield had looked at me like I'd ruined her son's wedding photos by existing. I should mention, for the record, that I am an excellent nurse and a genuinely terrible adult in every other respect. I will run into a trauma bay at a dead sprint for a stranger, and then spend 4 days avoiding my own laundry like it's personally threatened me. Aunt Carol has a whole bit about it. Daniel Hayes will reset your dislocated shoulder with a smile, and then let his own dishes grow a civilization in the sink, which is, unfortunately, completely accurate. Competence and effort, it turns out, are not the same skill, and I have generously decided to only develop one of them. "You're glowing," said Priya, my favorite fellow nurse and the only person who'd texted me, "Are you okay?" and then 4 seconds later, also, "Are you free now?" free with the correct amount of chaotic priorities. Nobody glows after getting dumped at a gala. What is wrong with you? Everyone keeps asking me that tonight. Because it's a valid question. Girl, sorry guy, your fiancé just publicly ditched you for a woman who owns a yacht named after herself, and you look like you won the lottery. I did, I said. The lottery of never having to pretend to like golf again. She was still laughing at that when the trauma bay doors banged open, and a very large, very bloody man was wheeled in, one hand pressed to his ribs, the other still clutching what appeared to be a broken bar stool leg, like a weapon he'd forgotten to put down. Motorcycle versus a very rude pothole, plus what I'm told was a bar fight he did not start, the paramedic rattled off. BP's stable, possible fractured rib, laceration to the left temple, patient is refusing sedation and being, and I quote, extremely difficult. I am not difficult, said the man on the gurney, in a voice like gravel wrapped in silk. I am particular. I stepped up to take vitals and got my first real look at him, dark hair matted with blood at one temple, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with a personal vendetta against soft edges, and eyes the gray-green of a stormy harbor, currently narrowed at me like I'd personally insulted him. Hi, I said, snapping on gloves. I'm Daniel. I'm going to be taking care of you tonight, and the first thing we're doing is putting down the bar stool. It's evidence. It's a liability. Sir, I will confiscate it. You can try. I looked at him. He looked at me. Something about the sheer, absurd stubbornness in his bloodied, ridiculously handsome face made a laugh crawl up my throat before I could stop it. You're smiling, he said, sounding personally offended. I am bleeding, and you're smiling. You're holding a barstool leg like Excalibur in a level 1 trauma center at midnight. Forgive me. For 1 second. One single, unguarded second. The corner of his mouth twitched, then he winced, pressed a hand harder to his ribs, and set the barstool leg down on the gurney like a knight surrendering his sword. Fine, he said, but I want it back. Noted, I said, and started cleaning the gash at his temple, and did not think about the way his eyes tracked my face the entire time like he was memorizing it for later. I definitely did not think about that. Nurses aren't supposed to think about that. Before he left, I made him list his symptoms twice, because head wounds make liars out of even the most stubborn patients, and somewhere between no, I don't feel dizzy, and the way his eyes had gone slightly unfocused tracking the ceiling tiles. I caught his wrist and pressed 2 fingers to his pulse, just to be sure. You're checking if I'm lying, he said, sounding almost delighted by the accusation. You're a man who brought a barstool leg to a hospital. I'm checking everything. My pulse is fine. A beat. It might be a little fast right now, though. That would be the concussion. Sure, he said, in a tone that suggested it was not, in fact, the concussion, and I decided very firmly not to examine that sentence any further, because I had 4 other patients and an ex-fiancé-shaped headache waiting for me at home, and I did not have room in my night for a stranger's stormy harbor eyes doing things to my composure. He asked for my name twice, once when he first came in, and once again 40 minutes later, like he'd wanted to hear it a second time to make sure he had it memorized correctly. Daniel, he repeated, testing the weight of it. That's a good, steady name. Nurse names should sound steady. Makes the bleeding easier to trust. Is that a compliment? I don't give many. Treasure it. I never got his name that night. He left before shift change, against medical advice, wearing a shirt Priya produced from the Lost and Found because his own was ruined, and the only trace he left behind was a business card, slid under my clipboard, blank except for a phone number, and in handwriting so neat it looked engraved, for the barstool. And the smiling. I did not call it. I am not an idiot. Men who fight bar fights and quote Arthurian legend about furniture are, statistically, trouble. I put the card in my wallet anyway. For the barstool, obviously. I should mention Priya properly. since she's going to be relevant to basically every terrible decision I make from here forward. Priya Anand, 29, day shift charge nurse with the instincts of a bloodhound for gossip and the loyalty of a golden retriever, had been my best friend since nursing school, where we'd bonded over a shared inability to pass a cadaver lab without making inappropriate jokes to survive it. She knew about Ethan before my own aunt did. She was, in short, the only person in Boston who was allowed to see me ugly cry over a med school textbook at 2 a.m, and never once brought it up again unless it was useful blackmail material. "You kept the card," she said the next morning, spotting it in my wallet while I dug for a hospital badge. "Daniel Hayes, you kept the card. For the barstool. Nobody keeps a business card for a barstool. That's not a category of card keeping that exists. That's a made-up category you invented 40 seconds ago to sound less thirsty." "I am a professional. I do not get thirsty over trauma patients. You checked his pulse twice. For medical reasons, Priya." "Uh-huh," she said, and went back to charting with the smug, unbearable satisfaction of a woman who knew she was right and intended to be insufferable about it for weeks. 3 days after the gala, I got a call from a law office I'd never heard of, asking me to come in at my earliest convenience regarding the estate of Richard Hayes, my father, dead 18 years. I sat in Aunt Carol's kitchen holding the phone like it might bite me. "Did you know about this?" She'd gone very still over her coffee. "Daniel, sit down. There's some things about your father I never told you, because I didn't understand them myself until a lawyer called me 6 months ago, asking questions I couldn't answer. Here is what I learned. Over the course of one extremely disorienting Tuesday afternoon in a glass-walled conference room downtown, from a sharp silver-haired attorney named Grace Sullivan, who spoke the way I imagine surgeons deliver bad news. Clearly, kindly, no wasted motion. My father had not, as I'd always been told, been a modest civil engineer who died with a small life insurance policy and a mountain of dignity. My father had been, under a name he'd legally used before I was born, Richard Hayes Meridian, the founder of a real estate and technology holding company that, over 18 years of being run by a discreet board of trustees per his will, had grown into an empire worth, as of last quarter's valuation, just north of $10 billion. He'd taken his mother's maiden name and walked away from the business world before I was born, married my mom, and lived a small, quiet life in Somerville because, according to a letter he'd left, which Grace slid across the table in an envelope with my name on it in handwriting I hadn't seen in 18 years and still recognized instantly, my hands shaking so hard I nearly tore it, he wanted his son to grow up knowing the weight of a dollar he earned, not one he inherited. The trust was structured to vest immediately, Grace explained, tapping a manila folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. The moment probate cleared and your identity as sole heir was confirmed. No waiting for a birthday, no ceremony. Just paperwork, which, I promise you, is the least romantic part of any inheritance. She paused, pulling a single clipped page free. There was one condition attached, though, a clause your father was very specific about. The vesting is void if, at the moment of confirmation, the heir is formally engaged to anyone from a family with existing financial entanglements to the estate. I blinked at her. In English? In English, had you married Ethan Whitfield as planned, the entire inheritance would have rerouted to a secondary trust, because the Whitfield family's construction firm did business with your father's company decades ago. Your father built that clause specifically to keep the Whitfields, or anyone like them, from marrying into money they hadn't earned. Which meant, in the deeply, cosmically hilarious language of legal documents, Ethan breaking our engagement 3 days before this meeting hadn't cost me anything. It had saved me $10 billion, and it had done it just in time, because the vesting clock had apparently been running toward my confirmation hearing for weeks, and had I still technically been engaged to Ethan on the day probate cleared, I'd have lost the whole thing to people who'd never once asked what I wanted. "I need you to say that again," I told Grace. "Slower," she said it again. Slower. It did not get less absurd. I called Aunt Carol from the sidewalk outside the law office, still holding my father's unopened letter because I wasn't ready, and said, "Aunt Carol, I need you to sit down." And she said, "Daniel, I am at work. I am literally holding a patient's chart." And I said, "I'm a billionaire." And there was a silence so long I thought the call had dropped. And then she said, very calmly, "I'm putting down this chart." She met me 20 minutes later at a coffee shop, 2 blocks from her hospital, still in scrubs, and I slid the unopened letter across the table between us, like it was something that might detonate. "You should read it," she said. "Whatever's in there, it's not going to hurt less by waiting. What if he explains why he lied to me my whole life and the explanation isn't good enough?" Aunt Carol reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. The same hands that had bandaged my scraped knees as a kid, that had signed every school permission slip, that had shown up to every single milestone a set of absent parents should have shown up for instead. "Then it's not good enough, and you'll be angry, and that's allowed too. But Daniel, your father was a good man before he was a rich one. Whatever's in that letter, I promise you the man who wrote it loved you enough to give you an entire ordinary childhood instead of a complicated, guarded one. That's not nothing." I opened the letter that night, alone, at my kitchen table, and read 4 pages in my father's cramped, engineer's handwriting, explaining a version of himself I'd never known, a man who'd grown up with money and watched it curdle every relationship he had, who'd built something extraordinary out of nothing twice, once with a company and once with a family, and who wanted, more than any board seat or building with his name on it, for his son to know what it felt like to be loved for absolutely no reason attached to a dollar sign. "I know this inheritance complicates things," he wrote, near the end. "I built the clause about the Whitfields because I saw how transactional that family could be, even when I was young, and I couldn't stomach the idea of you inheriting my mistakes along with my money. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I'm sorry for all the ordinary days I don't get to have with you. But I hope you had them anyway. I hope Carol gave you a normal, loud, difficult, wonderful life, because that was worth more to me than every zero in that trust account. Whatever you do with the company, son, build something you actually want. Don't let anyone talk you into a life that isn't yours." I cried for the first time since the funeral I barely remembered, and it wasn't grief exactly. It was something closer to relief, the same strange cousin of relief I'd felt at the gala, except this time it came with tears instead of champagne. The Whitfields found out 4 days later, because of course they did. Boston Old Money has a gossip network faster than any newswire, and Aunt Carol got to witness, with the kind of glee usually reserved for watching your team win the Super Bowl. Mrs. Whitfield calling our apartment to reconnect. "Daniel, it's been too long," in a voice so saccharine it should have come with a cavity warning. She wants to know if the engagement clause is flexible. Aunt Carol reported, holding the phone away from her ear like it had personally wronged her. "She's asking if you and Ethan might revisit things now that circumstances have changed. Tell her the clause requires the engagement to have already existed the day probate cleared," I said, "which it didn't, thanks to Ethan, and also, frankly, requires me to want it, which I do not." Aunt Carol relayed a slightly more diplomatic version. I heard Mrs. Whitfield's voice spike through the receiver from 4 feet away. The rest of that week passed in a strange, suspended blur. Grace Sullivan walking me through preliminary paperwork thick enough to double as a doorstop, Aunt Carol alternating between fierce pride and a low, simmering anger at a man 18 years dead for keeping something this large a secret, and me, mostly, just trying to keep breathing through shifts at the hospital where nobody yet knew my name had become a headline. That didn't last. By Thursday, a resident I barely knew asked me, with poorly disguised curiosity, whether it was true I owned like half the seaport. And by Friday, there was a tabloid photographer loitering by the ambulance bay entrance until hospital security very politely suggested he loiter somewhere with fewer HIPAA violations attached. Priya took to walking me to my car after every shift, arms crossed, glaring at anyone who so much as glanced our way with a badge that said press on it, which was, admittedly, exactly 0 people, but the principle mattered to her. I went back to my shift that night mostly to remember what my life looked like before it turned into a soap opera, and found, tucked into my locker where I absolutely had not put it, a small bouquet of stargazer lilies and a note in that same engraved handwriting. "Heard about the will. For what it's worth, you handled the gala better than anyone I've ever seen. The Barstool Guy." I stared at the flowers for a full minute before I registered the deeper, more alarming question underneath the sweet one. How did a man I'd treated for one motorcycle accident know about my father's will before the ink was dry on the paperwork? I still didn't call the number. I did, however, keep the lilies, in water, on my kitchen table, where I looked at them more than was strictly reasonable for a man who claimed he wasn't interested. His name, I learned 2 weeks later, was Julian Cross, and I learned it the way most of Boston did, from a headline. Cross Development acquires Seaport parcel in $400 M deal. CEO Julian Cross says company building for the next generation. The photo underneath was unmistakably Barstool Guy, minus the blood, wearing a suit that fit him like it had personally sworn loyalty to his shoulders, jaw set in the exact same stubborn line he'd worn while refusing sedation. I nearly choked on my coffee. Priya, reading over my shoulder at the nurse's station, went very quiet, then very loud. That's him? That's Barstool Guy? Daniel. Daniel, he is 32 years old and worth actual billions, and he left you flowers and you have not called him? I don't know him. You stitched his head. That's a professional relationship Priya doesn't extend to. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered on reflex, because our nurses answer everything on reflex. We are physiologically incapable of letting a phone ring. Daniel Hayes, said the voice, gravel wrapped in silk, and I would have known it blindfolded. I hear congratulations are in order. $10 billion is a significant raise from nurse who confiscates bar stools. How did you get this number? You gave it to the hospital when you treated me. I have excellent lawyers and worse manners. Have dinner with me. I don't even know you. You know I don't take sedation well, and I return borrowed shirts eventually. That's more than most first dates start with. I looked at Priya, who was mouthing say yes so aggressively I thought she'd pull a muscle. Why, I said, stalling, does the CEO of a $400 million real estate deal want to have dinner with a nurse he met bleeding on a gurney? There was a pause on the line, brief but real, like he was deciding how honest to be. Because you laughed at me instead of being impressed by me, he said finally. Do you know how rare that is in my life? Everyone in this city has spent a decade being impressed at me. You confiscated my bar stool. Something in my chest did that same small cartwheel it had done at the gala, except this time it wasn't relief. This time it felt dangerously close to the beginning of something. One dinner, I said, and if you're insufferable, I'm keeping the barstool leg as a permanent souvenir. It's already framed, he said, and I could hear the smile in it, in my office, beneath a small plaque that says undefeated. I hung up laughing, which I would come to learn was the exact effect Julian Cross had on me from that day forward. Infuriating, and somehow, entirely without my permission, delightful. He picked a restaurant on the harbor, small, unmarked, the kind of place that doesn't need a sign because everyone who matters already knows where it is. I wore the nicest thing I owned, which was still, by Boston old money standards, business casual for a funeral, and I decided I didn't care. Julian stood when I arrived, old-fashioned, unnecessary, and it did something unfortunate to my knees anyway, and the first thing he said was, "You came." I said I would. People say a lot of things to me they don't mean. It's a hazard of the job. I'm not people, I said, sitting. I'm a nurse who's seen you cry over a rib fracture. I didn't cry. You made a sound like a kicked golden retriever. That was a manly sound of controlled discomfort. Sure, I said, and he laughed, really laughed, head back, all the careful CEO polish cracking for one unguarded second, and I thought, with the particular clarity of a man watching his own downfall arrive on schedule, oh, I am in so much trouble. He'd requested a table in the corner, away from the windows most people fought for, and when I pointed that out, he admitted, a little sheepishly for a man who ran board meetings like weather systems, that he'd wanted somewhere quiet enough that he wouldn't have to compete with a view for my attention. It was, I would learn over the following months, a very Julian thing to do, strategize a first date the way he'd strategize a 9-figure acquisition, and then get flustered admitting he'd done it. The restaurant smelled like butter and wood smoke, low golden light pooling over white tablecloths, the harbor visible through floor-to-ceiling windows going navy as the sun dropped behind the water. Somewhere behind us a cello played something unhurried, and Julian, out of his suit jacket by the time the appetizers arrived, sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way that should not have been distracting and absolutely was, kept doing this small, unconscious thing where he leaned forward whenever I spoke, like he didn't want to miss a single word, even the boring ones about triage protocols. Dinner went the way good first dates go in movies, and almost never in real life. Easy, funny, occasionally quiet in a way that didn't feel like a void to fill but like a room we were both comfortable standing in. He told me his mother had been an R nurse before she passed, which was why, half-conscious and bleeding, some old instinct in him had trusted me instantly. I told him about my father's letter, still unopened on my kitchen table at the time, because I wasn't ready, And he didn't tell me I should be ready. He just nodded like that made perfect sense, and reached over and squeezed my hand once, warm and brief, and let go before it could turn into a whole thing. It was, I would realize much later, the exact moment the real turning point arrived, not a grand declaration, not a kiss under fireworks, just a man who barely knew me understanding, instinctively, when to hold my hand and when to let it go. Some people spend years learning that. He seemed to have been born knowing it. "Can I ask you something?" I said. Over dessert neither of us had ordered but had somehow appeared anyway, because apparently that's a billionaire perk. Why flowers? Why the note? You could have just called. Julian turned his water glass slowly, considering. My father built Cross Development from nothing, and taught me that every relationship in this city is a transaction. Everyone wants something from me before they've learned my last name. He looked up. You didn't know my last name for 2 weeks. You kept a barstool leg as a threat instead of a business card as an opportunity. I wanted. He paused, and for the first time all night looked almost unsure, which on him was a strange and lovely thing to witness. I wanted to be looked at like a person, not a portfolio. You did that without trying. I didn't have a joke for that. For once in my life, I let the silence sit and reached across the table and took his hand back. Fair warning, I said. I'm still going to make fun of you constantly. And fair warning again, I'm an incredible nurse and a genuinely terrible houseguest. I will save your life in a trauma bay and then leave a wet towel on your very expensive floor for 4 days out of pure, committed laziness. Noted, he said, entirely too delighted by this information. I'll hire someone for the towel. That defeats the entire purpose of the warning. I'm counting on it, he said, and smiled like I'd handed him something rare. Fortune, as it turns out, makes previously disinterested people extremely interested in you very fast, and the Whitfields, having spent 3 weeks watching Boston society buzz about Daniel Hayes, the secret Hayes Meridian heir, and worse, watching photos surface of me at dinner with Julian Cross, whose net worth made theirs look like a rounding error, decided the correct response was a reconciliation gala. I got the invitation via a hand-delivered card that Aunt Carol accepted at the door with the enthusiasm of a woman accepting a subpoena. The Whitfield family cordially invites Daniel Hayes to celebrate family, legacy, and new beginnings. New beginnings, Aunt Carol read aloud, deadpan, meaning they want Ethan to undump you before the ink dries on your trust fund. Should I go? Absolutely you should go, she said. I want to see their faces when you show up with a man who could buy their entire company by Thursday lunch and skip dessert. I texted Julian, mostly as a joke. Would you ever consider attending an extremely transparent gold-digging gala with me, purely to watch a wealthy family suffer socially? His reply came in 4 seconds. Daniel, I have been waiting my entire life for this invitation. I'm wearing my best suit. I'm bringing the barstool leg for moral support. Do not bring the barstool leg. It's already in the car. The gala was, predictably, the same ballroom, the same Boston Harbor Hotel, and the same nervous energy, except this time it was aimed entirely at me. Mrs. Whitfield intercepted us before we'd finished checking our coats, her smile so tight it looked structurally dangerous. Daniel, you look well, and you brought a friend? Julian Cross, Julian said, extending a hand with the pleasant, terrifying calm of a shark that's decided not to bite yet. We're dating. The word landed in the small circle around us like a dropped glass. Ethan, who'd been approaching with the specific expression of a man rehearsing an apology, stopped mid-step. Dating, Mrs. Whitfield repeated, faintly. 3 months, I supplied helpfully. He fights barstools and cries during rib fractures. It's very romantic. I do not cry. Golden retriever noise, I reminded him, and he sighed, long-suffering, and put his hand on the small of my back like he'd done it 100 times, and Mrs. Whitfield's eyes tracked that small, easy gesture with the particular horror of a woman watching $10 billion walk away in real time. Ethan finally reached us, and to his credit, because whatever else he wasn't cruel, just weak, and there's a difference. He looked genuinely sheepish. Daniel, can we talk? Privately. Julian's tightened almost imperceptibly at my back. I squeezed his fingers once. I've got this, and followed Ethan to the edge of the terrace. My mother's going to try to get you to reconsider the engagement tonight, Ethan said, without preamble. I want you to know I told her not to. I know I hurt you at the last one of these, and I know you said you were fine, and I didn't believe you, but... He exhaled. You actually are fine, aren't you? You're better than fine. I really am, I said, and meant it without a single trace of spite. Ethan, I loved you. I did, like a brother I never chose, but ended up grateful for anyway. But you did me the biggest favor of my life dumping me on that stage, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make this conversation easier." He laughed, surprised, a little rueful. "Vivian says the same thing, actually, that you looked like you'd won something." "I did. For what it's worth," he said, "he looks at you like my father used to look at my mother." Before things got complicated, "Don't let my family talk you into anything tonight. You don't owe us the empire back." It was, honestly, the most decent thing Ethan Whitfield had ever said to me, and I told him so, and he laughed again, and for the first time in 20 years, standing on that terrace, I felt like we were finally actually just friends, unburdened of the thing neither of us had asked for, Mrs. Whitfield cornered me 20 minutes later anyway, right on schedule, all syrup and strategy, suggesting that given recent developments, perhaps Ethan and I might revisit our understanding, and perhaps a small, private arrangement could be made regarding the trust, purely for the good of both families. Julian appeared at my shoulder with 2 glasses of champagne, handed me one, and said, pleasantly, to Mrs. Whitfield, I couldn't help overhearing, "I run a fairly large development company, Mrs. Whitfield. I understand contracts. Daniel's trust has a clause specifically designed to prevent exactly this conversation. I'd hate for word to get out that the Whitfield family attempted to circumvent a legal trust instrument at a party. Very bad for a construction firm's reputation with banks." Mrs. Whitfield's smile did not so much fall as evacuate the premises entirely. "That's not, I would never." "Of course not," Julian said, warm as a knife. "Enjoy the gala." He steered me away with a hand at my back, and the second we were out of earshot, I started laughing so hard I had to lean on him for balance. "Very bad for a construction firm's reputation with banks," I quoted. "You didn't even raise your voice." "I never have to," he said, looking entirely too pleased with himself. "It's more fun this way. Besides," he tucked a strand of hair back from my face, thumb brushing my cheekbone, gentle in a way that didn't match one single thing about his reputation. "Nobody talks to my nurse like that. Your nurse." "My favorite one," he amended, and I decided, watching the string lights catch in his stupid gray-green eyes, that I could probably forgive him almost anything if he kept looking at me like that. Everything was going well, which in my experience is exactly when the universe remembers you exist and decides to test you. 3 months in, Julian asked me to move into his place on Beacon Hill. Not dramatically, just over breakfast, half a bagel in his hand, like he was asking about my shift schedule. "You're here 5 nights a week anyway. Your commute to the hospital is shorter from here." It's just logical. It was in fact extremely logical, which is exactly why I panicked. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about going from modest nurse with a dead father's mysterious past to billionaire heir dating another billionaire in the span of 3 months. Somewhere in there, a small, insistent voice starts asking whether anyone loves you, or whether you've just become the most convenient headline of somebody's life. I'd spent 20 years being loved conditionally, contractually, by a family that saw me as an understanding to be honored. And now here was Julian, who I trusted more than made sense for 3 months of knowing him, asking me to move in, and instead of feeling happy, I felt the ground tilt. "I need to think about it," I said, which was a lie, because what I actually needed was to spiral, quietly for 4 days, avoiding his calls, telling myself I was processing, while actually just being a coward with excellent bedside manner for everyone except myself. To be fair to me, I did also use 2 of those 4 days to finally do my own laundry, so it wasn't a total wash emotionally or literally. He showed up at my apartment on day 5, still in his suit from a board meeting, tie loosened, looking like he hadn't slept, and I opened the door already braced for a fight. "I'm not going to yell at you," he said, before I could say anything. "I just need to know what I did. You didn't do anything, Daniel." His voice cracked, just slightly, on my name, and I hated that it did, because I'd done that. I have spent my entire life being wanted for what I have. My mother died when I was 19, and my father taught me that love is a negotiation you win by having more leverage than the other person. You are the first person who has ever made me feel like I could lose leverage, and it wouldn't matter, because you weren't keeping score. And then I asked you to move in, and you disappeared, and I don't. He stopped, jaw tight, and I watched Julian Cross, alpha, CEO, undefeated Barstool duelist, look genuinely, completely lost. I don't know how to fix what I don't understand. "For what it's worth," I said, mostly to keep myself from crying before I'd even gotten to the hard part. You standing on my doorstep in a $3,000 suit, looking like a golden retriever who lost his favorite tennis ball, is deeply unfair to my emotional stability right now. That got a startled, wet laugh out of him. Brief, but real, and something in his shoulders loosened half an inch. Focus, he said. You were about to tell me something important, and I refuse to let you deflect with the golden retriever thing twice in one relationship. Fine. I took a breath. I got scared, I admitted, that I'm just the next transaction, that you love the idea of a nurse who wasn't impressed by you, and once I'm just part of your life, ordinary, in your space every day, you'll get bored, the way Ethan got bored, and I'll have given up the one thing I've never had to give anyone. My own space, my own life, that isn't built around somebody else's family or somebody else's money. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then, instead of arguing, he sat down on my doorstep, suit and all, ruining a very expensive pair of trousers on my dusty steps, and patted the space beside him. Then don't move in, he said when I sat. Marry me instead. Wildly impractical, I know. 3 months in, my lawyer will have an aneurysm. But here's my logic. An apartment is something you can leave. A marriage, done right, is something you build together, on purpose, every single day, and I would like to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm not leaving, one boring, unremarkable Tuesday at a time, until you believe it in your bones. That is, I said, the least romantic proposal I have ever heard, and also somehow the only one that's ever made me cry. I contain multitudes, he said, and wiped my cheek with his thumb, careful, like I was something worth being careful with. Is that a yes? Or do I need to go get the barstool leg for dramatic effect? Ask me properly, I said, laughing through actual tears now, and maybe. He got down on one knee on my dusty front step, in his ruined trousers, and asked me properly, and I said yes before he even finished the sentence. And somewhere down the block a dog started barking, which felt, honestly, like the appropriate level of chaos for my entire life at this point. I need to introduce one more person before we get to the wedding, because leaving her out would be dishonest, and also because she remains, to this day, the single most aggravating 6 weeks of my engagement. Her name was Fiona Reyes Ashcroft, 34, Senior VP of Acquisitions at Cross Development, and according to the extremely unsubtle office rumor mill Priya had somehow tapped into despite not even working at the same company, the woman everyone assumed Julian would eventually marry, before the nurse showed up. She was brilliant, sharp-suited, and treated me, from the very first gala she cornered me at, with the specific chilled politeness of a woman doing complex math behind her eyes. Daniel, she said, at a cross-development holiday party I'd been dragged to as the newly minted fiancé, extending a hand with a grip like a vice wrapped in silk gloves. I've heard so much about you, Julian's nurse. How refreshingly ordinary. Fiona, Julian said, appearing at my side with the exact speed of a man who'd learned to recognize the particular pitch of Fiona, being Fiona from 3 rooms away. Behave. I'm being perfectly friendly. You called him refreshingly ordinary, in the tone people usually reserve for describing whether they find personally offensive. I contain multitudes, Fiona said, stealing, I noted, Julian's own line, which told me everything I needed to know about how long these two had known each other and how comfortable she still felt borrowing his sentences. For 6 weeks, Fiona ran what I privately called Operation Subtle Sabotage, accidentally double-booking herself with Julian for dinners that conflicted with plans he'd made with me, sending him articles about statistically higher divorce rates in relationships with significant power imbalances, with no comment attached, and once, memorably, showing up to a charity auction in a dress the exact same shade of deep blue Julian had once told me, half asleep and unguarded, was his favorite color on me. I am generally not a jealous person. 20 years of being engaged to someone who loved someone else had inoculated me pretty thoroughly against the emotion, but there's a difference between jealousy and simple, weary irritation at watching someone try to quietly dismantle your relationship using nothing but scheduling conflicts and passive aggression, and by week 5, I was running low on patience. You could just tell her to stop, I said, one night after the 3rd canceled dinner in a row. I have told her to stop. 4 times. She doesn't listen to me the way she'd listen to a board vote. Julian rubbed his eyes, looking, for once, genuinely tired rather than amused. She's been with the company since I took over from my father. I owe her a lot professionally. That doesn't mean I owe her this. So what do we do? We, he said, and something wicked crept into his expression, the same look he'd worn dismantling Mrs. Whitfield at the gala, Let her underestimate you exactly once more. It's the only mistake she'll need to make. I should say, for context, that by this point I'd developed my own theory about Fiona, which I kept mostly to myself because Julian got a specific, guilty look whenever I brought it up. The look of a man who suspects his employee, has a crush on him, and would very much like to keep pretending he hasn't noticed. I didn't think Fiona wanted Julian, exactly. I thought Fiona had spent a decade helping him build something out of the wreckage his father left behind, had watched him become someone steadier and kinder than the man he could have turned into, and had privately decided she'd earned a say in who got to stand next to that. It didn't make her behavior less exhausting. It did make it easier to be patient with. The opportunity arrived at the company's annual investor dinner, where Fiona, apparently deciding subtlety had run its course, cornered me by the bar while Julian was pulled into a conversation across the room, and said, with the particular smile of a woman delivering a rehearsed line, "You know, Daniel, I give it a year." Julian's never sustained interest in anything that didn't challenge him, and forgive me, but nursing a broken rib isn't exactly a boardroom. I considered, for one glorious second, several unprofessional responses. I went with the true one instead. "Fiona, I've watched grown men flatline and talked their families through the worst 10 minutes of their lives without my voice shaking once. I've set my own dislocated shoulder on a camping trip because the nearest hospital was 90 minutes out, and I didn't have time to wait for help. I don't need to challenge Julian in a boardroom. I keep him alive when the boardroom eventually gives him the heart attack you're all pretending isn't coming from the hours he works." I took a slow sip of my drink. "Also, I've read his cap table. Twice. For fun. I find corporate structuring relaxing after a 12-hour trauma shift, which either makes me the most boring man you've ever met, or exactly qualified to know when someone's angling for a board seat by attaching herself to the CEO's love life. I genuinely can't decide which. Can you?" Fiona's expression did something complicated, somewhere between offense and unmistakably respect. "You read the cap table, cover to cover, twice. Also the investor deck from Q3, which, incidentally, has a typo on slide 11 that nobody's caught yet. There instead of there. It's driving me insane." There was a pause. Then, astonishingly, Fiona laughed. A real one, surprised out of her, and set down her glass. "Okay, I underestimated you. That doesn't happen often. Fix the typo yourself. I dare you, watch 3 VPs have breakdowns when they can't figure out who touched the deck, already planning it." She studied me for a long moment, something shifting behind her calculating eyes into something almost like approval. "For what it's worth," she said, quieter, "I wasn't trying to be cruel. Julian's father ran this company like a war, and Julian spent his whole life afraid of turning into him. I've watched him build something different, brick by brick, and I got scared someone new might undo it. That's on me, not you. I'm not trying to undo anything," I said. "I just want the boring Tuesdays. He can keep the empire." "That," Fiona said, picking her glass back up, "might be the first time anyone said that to him and meant it." She raised her drink half an inch, a small, grudging toast. "Welcome to the company. Daniel, try not to let him work himself into the ground. God knows the rest of us have failed at that job." Julian found me 20 minutes later, visibly bracing for casualties, and found instead Fiona and me deep in an argument about whether the investor deck's color scheme was aggressively beige or confidently neutral, which he later told me was, without question, the single most unsettling thing he'd witnessed all year. "You two are terrifying together," he said. "We fixed your typo," I said. "You're welcome? What typo?" "Slide 11, Fiona and I said, in unison, and Julian looked between us with the exact expression of a man who has just realized he created a monster and does not, in fact, regret it even slightly. Word travels fast in Boston, and nothing travels faster than the news that the city's most eligible billionaire nurse just got engaged to its most eligible billionaire developer. The Whitfields, to their credit, sent a genuinely gracious card. Vivian sent a bottle of very good champagne, with a note that read "Knew it the second he stopped hiding you." Ethan called to say congratulations and ask, sheepishly, if Julian could maybe not buy the Whitfield family's construction firm out of spite, and Julian, listening on speaker, said, "No promises," and then bought a controlling stake anyway, purely as a wedding gift to me, framed as diversifying the portfolio. "You didn't have to do that," I told him. "I absolutely did not have to," he agreed, entirely unrepentant. "It was extremely satisfying." Mrs. Whitfield's reaction, relayed to me secondhand by Aunt Carol, who now had a standing lunch date with Vivian purely to gossip, was reportedly a sound not unlike a tea kettle. I choose to believe this was accurate. Getting there took 4 months of the most chaotic wedding planning in recorded Boston history, mostly because Julian and I discovered almost immediately that we had wildly incompatible instincts about what small meant. 50 people, he said, over the venue's proposed floor plan, is small. 50 people is a company retreat, Julian. I want 20. I want it to fit in Aunt Carol's backyard if it has to. Your aunt's backyard does not have parking for 20 cars. Then we valet, or people take the tea, or, Julian, why are you looking at the floor plan like it's an acquisition? Because everything is an acquisition if you plan it correctly, he said, dead serious, and I had to leave the room for a full minute to laugh it out of my system before I could negotiate further. He came back to the negotiating table 20 minutes later with an actual spreadsheet, tabs, color coding, a formula that calculated per guest cost against emotional necessity, which he'd apparently scored each potential attendee on using a scale he refused to explain. When I asked if Fiona knew he moonlighted as a wedding planner with the soul of a management consultant, he looked genuinely wounded and said, "This is how I show love," and I decided, against my better judgment, that I found that unbearably endearing. We landed, eventually, on 32 people, a private stretch of the harbor at golden hour, and a caterer Priya, vetted personally on the grounds that, if the food's bad, I will never let either of you live it down. This is a public service. Aunt Carol insisted on doing the flowers herself. Stargazer lilies, obviously, an entire arch of them, because she'd heard the story about the locker bouquet from Priya approximately 4 seconds after it happened, and had never once let either of us forget it. Even Fiona got roped in, unofficially, running interference with the cross-development board when 3 separate executives tried to turn the guest list into a networking opportunity. Grace Sullivan, who had officially closed my father's estate file 2 months earlier, sent a card with a bottle of very old scotch and a note that read, "Your father would have hated the seating chart negotiations almost as much as you clearly do. Congratulations, Daniel," and I laughed so hard reading it in the kitchen that Julian came to check I hadn't hurt myself. "Absolutely not," Fiona told the executives, according to Julian, who relayed it with the pride of a man watching his protégé graduate. "This is Daniel's day. You'll get your networking at the shareholder dinner like civilized people." The morning of the wedding, Aunt Carol found me in the guest room of Julian's Beacon Hill townhouse, tying my own tie badly for the 3rd time, hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with nerves about Julian and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming awareness that my father wasn't there to see it. "He'd have liked him," she said, without me having to explain, taking the tie gently out of my hands and fixing it herself, the way she used to before my first day of kindergarten. "Your father never cared about money, Daniel. Not really. He cared about people who didn't perform for it. Julian doesn't perform. I watched him corner 3 lawyers into fixing your trust paperwork in a single afternoon out of pure stubbornness, and I watched him hold your hand under the table at that horrible reconciliation gala like it was the only thing keeping him steady. Not you. Your dad would have liked him. I like him. Now stop fidgeting. You're going to make me redo this." I didn't cry, mostly because Aunt Carol had strategically timed that speech for exactly 90 seconds before I needed to walk anywhere, which I've since decided was less spontaneous emotional wisdom and more 18 years of expert nurse-aunt tactical planning, and I told her so, and she said, "Both things can be true," and kissed my cheek and walked me out. We got married in June, on the harbor, small and stupidly happy. No gala, no 200 strangers, just people who actually loved us. Priya crying loudly enough to be heard over the vows, despite insisting beforehand she absolutely would not cry. She wasn't that kind of friend. Aunt Carol walking me down a very short aisle because she'd earned it more than any absent parent ever could have, and Julian waiting at the end of it under an arch of stargazer lilies, in a suit that fit him like it always did, looking at me like I was the only person in Boston. He'd written his own vows, which I hadn't expected, because Julian Cross did not, as a rule, do things unrehearsed. But there he stood, notacards visibly shaking in his hand, voice steady even as his fingers weren't. "I spent 32 years being extremely good at getting what I wanted," he said, "and completely unpracticed at wanting anything that couldn't be negotiated for. You didn't negotiate. You confiscated a bar stool and told me to put it down. and something in me has been trying to earn your attention properly ever since. I promise you every unremarkable Tuesday I have left. I promise to keep losing every argument about toast. I promise the Barstool a place of honor for the rest of our lives, because without it, I never would have found the one person in this city who looked at everything I have and only ever wanted the parts of me that weren't for sale. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last line, and he cleared his throat, unbothered, and added, "Also, for the record, I did not cry during the rib fracture. I want that officially on record, in front of witnesses, at my own wedding." He absolutely cried. I told the harbor, the guests, God, and everyone assembled, through my own unhelpful tears, like a man who'd just lost a very important tennis ball, and the entire ceremony dissolved into laughter exactly the way I'd wanted my whole life to feel. Warm, a little chaotic, entirely unmistakably ours. He kept the Barstool leg framed in our new shared office, the plaque now read, "Undefeated, still worth it." The reception ran 3 hours longer than scheduled, because Aunt Carol commandeered the small band Julian had hired and insisted on requesting every song from my childhood in order, chronologically, while Priya narrated the entire thing to the group chat in real time with a level of detail usually reserved for war correspondents. Ethan and Vivian showed up for the last hour, having been invited more out of genuine goodwill than obligation, and Ethan spent most of it standing near the dessert table looking, for the first time in the 2 decades I'd known him, entirely at peace, like a man who'd finally set down a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying either. We honeymooned in Maine, of all places, my choice, not his, because Julian's first suggestion had been a private island, obviously, delivered with the total confidence of a man who genuinely did not understand why anyone would choose a rented cabin with questionable plumbing over a private island, and I'd had to explain, patiently, that I did not want our first week of marriage to feel like a business trip with better linens. A cabin, he'd repeated, the way a man repeats a foreign phrase he's trying to understand through sheer force of will, in Maine, with, I assume, no staff. Just us, a lake, and a wood stove you're going to have to learn to use, because I refuse to be the only person in this marriage who can start a fire. I can start a fire. You can start a fire in a boardroom, Julian. That's different. He'd sulked, theatrically, for exactly 1 afternoon of packing, and then spent our first morning at the cabin standing over the wood stove with the intense, furrowed concentration he usually reserved for 8-figure acquisitions, muttering instructions to himself under his breath, until he produced, against all odds, a genuinely respectable fire, at which point he'd turned to me with such unguarded, ridiculous pride that I'd had to kiss him just to keep from laughing, at how thoroughly a grown man could resemble a kid who'd built his first blanket fort. I did it. You did. I would like this noted somewhere official. Absolutely not. You already have a Barstool leg with a plaque, one framed object of pure ego per marriage. That's a completely arbitrary rule. It's the rule I'm making up right now, which makes it a real rule. A man of the earth deserves recognition. You are, at this exact moment, wearing cashmere loungewear that costs more than my car, and I found you Googling how to start a fire on your phone for 20 minutes before you actually did it. That is confidential information. You left the search history open on the shared tablet, Julian. He had, mercifully, no response to that, which I considered the single greatest victory of our entire honeymoon. We spent that week doing almost nothing, hiking trails neither of us knew, badly attempting to fish and catching exactly one sad small trout that Julian insisted on releasing back out of professional courtesy, one predator to another, reading on a dock until the sun went down, and talking, for hours, about nothing that mattered and everything that did, the way you only really get to when there's no gala to attend, no board meeting to prep for, no 18 years of expectations sitting on either of your shoulders. One afternoon we drove into the nearest town for groceries, and Julian, presented with a checkout line and a bored-looking teenage cashier who had absolutely no idea who he was, seemed almost giddy about it, paid in cash, made small talk about the weather, and told me afterward with genuine wonder that it was the first time in a decade he'd bought his own eggs. I watched him relearn slowly, over 7 quiet days, how to exist without an audience, and he watched me relearn, just as slowly, how to let someone see the parts of my life that weren't about taking care of somebody else first. On the last night, sitting on the dock with a blanket around both our shoulders and the loons calling somewhere out on the black water, Julian said quietly, I could do this. The unremarkable Tuesdays. I wasn't sure I could, honestly, before this week. I've never gone 7 days without checking a stock ticker in my adult life. But I could do this with you, indefinitely. Good, I said, tucking myself further into his side. Because I already told the toaster it's staying. You told a toaster. I have priorities. He laughed, that real, unguarded laugh, and pressed a kiss to my hair, and we sat there until the fire in the cabin behind us burned down to embers, married exactly 1 week, and for the first time in either of our overcomplicated lives, entirely, boringly, perfectly content. You burned the toast again, Julian said, from behind me, arms sliding around my waist while I stood at our kitchen counter, staring accusingly at 2 black rectangles that used to be bread. The toaster is defective. The toaster is fine. You were reading a medical journal instead of watching it. You also left 3 mugs in the sink again, which I know for a fact you've been staring at for 2 days, waiting for them to wash themselves through sheer force of ignoring them. I am a multitasking professional with priorities. You're a menace with a badge and a laundry basket he refuses to acknowledge, he said, kissing the top of my head, and I let him, because 6 months into marriage, I'd learned that arguing with Julian Cross when he was right was a losing battle and also, somehow, my favorite hobby. Our life, post-Empire inheritance and post-billion-dollar drama, had settled into something so aggressively, wonderfully normal that I sometimes had to remind myself I technically owned a company worth 10 figures. I still worked 3 shifts a week at Mass General because I liked it, because it was mine before any of this happened, and because Julian had learned, fast, not to argue with a man who could set a bone faster than most people could parallel park. He still ran cross-development, still terrified boardrooms into silence with a raised eyebrow, and still somehow came home every single night and turned into a man who burned toast rescue missions into a competitive sport. Movie night, he announced, setting down 2 new, non-charred pieces of toast like a peace offering. Your pick. I already know it's going to be something with an implausible amount of medical accuracy that you'll pause to criticize. It's called quality control. It's called you yelling, "That's not how CPR works" at a television for 90 minutes. Because it's not. You'd know that too if you'd let me finish the CPR refresher course I signed you up for. I run a company, Daniel. I don't have time to practice chest compressions on a plastic torso. You have time to frame a barstool leg. That was important. It was deranged, is what it was, and I married you anyway. So really the joke's on me. I stole a bite of his toast out of principle. He let me, which was somehow more romantic than anything he could have said. Aunt Carol had come by for Sunday dinner the week before, taken one look around our absurdly large kitchen. Julian had insisted on a 6-burner stove for a household that mostly used the toaster, and on special occasions the rice cooker, and declared, with the deadpan authority of a woman who'd raised me on a nurse's salary in a 2-bedroom walk-up, "This kitchen is bigger than my entire first apartment. I raised you in less space than your pantry. You want the pantry, Aunt Carol? It's yours. I'll build you a guest room next to it." "Don't tempt me," she'd said, but she'd hugged Julian goodbye that night a beat longer than she needed to, and I'd caught the look on her face. Something like a woman finally, fully exhaling after 18 years of holding her breath for me, and had to excuse myself to the kitchen so neither of them would see me get emotional over a hug. Priya, for her part, had informed us both that she expected to be named godmother to whatever chaos you two eventually produce, biological, adopted, or acquired via one of Julian's real estate deals gone sideways, and had already, unprompted, started a group chat titled Team Barstool that existed solely to send us memes at deeply inappropriate hours of our respective shifts. Fiona sent a card for our first Christmas as a married couple that read, in her sharp, efficient handwriting, "Still checking the cap table, still terrifyingly thorough. The company's better for it, so is he." I kept it taped inside my locker at the hospital, next to a photo of the wedding, next to the small, dried stargazer lily I'd pressed flat between 2 pieces of wax paper the week he'd left them in my locker, back when I still hadn't called the number on his business card. He laughed, that real laugh, the one I'd first heard over a broken rib and a stolen barstool leg, the one that still did something unfair to my chest every single time, and pulled me down onto the couch beside him, my head finding the spot on his shoulder that had become, without either of us deciding it on purpose, simply mine. "Hey," he said, quiet, running a thumb along my knuckles the way he did when he was about to say something he meant completely. "Thank you For picking a bad medical drama? For the barstool, he said. For laughing at me instead of being impressed. For every boring Tuesday since. He pressed a kiss to my temple, right over the small scar I still had from a training accident years back, the one he always found with his mouth, like it was a landmark on a map only he'd memorized. Best decision I ever made was refusing that sedation. You were being difficult. I was being particular, he corrected, and I laughed into his shoulder, and outside our window the harbor lights came on one by one, and somewhere in a framed plaque in the next room, a barstool leg kept its permanent, undefeated watch over the strange, ridiculous $10 billion, entirely worth-it life we'd built. On purpose, together, one unremarkable, wonderful Tuesday at a time. And that's the whole ridiculous $10 billion love story. If Daniel and Julian's chaos made you laugh, or if you just want to know what Fiona gets up to next, because let's be honest, she deserves her own book, follow the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. See you in the next one.